Today we are going to talk a little bit about some guidelines for your yardage calculations for the quilt math. This is another question that I get a lot about from my clients, and so we're going to talk about several different kind of tips and guidelines that can help as you're figuring your yardage quantities for your pattern. First things first is kind of the most important rule about yardage requirements, and that is to keep your instructions as simple as possible while still minimizing fabric, right? So this is a balancing act. You're going to have to make some decisions as a designer as to whether to prioritize kind of cutting simplicity or minimizing fabric, or kind of somewhere in the middle based on what your customers and readers want. So what I'm going to show you is kind of a series of yardage cutting layouts that you could choose, and we'll kind of talk about the pros and cons of each. So this first one is probably the simplest of what I'm going to show you. Your first dimension is always going to be the width of the original strip that you cut, and then you're just making a subcut along the way, right? And so here you're cutting 2 9-inch by width of fabric strips. From the strips, you're going to cut 5 9-inch squares and 5 9-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles. Then we cut a second set of 4.5-inch wide strips and cut a certain number of 4.5-inch squares from them, right? So this is great. It's very, very straightforward. We've got a lot of simplicity here, but you'll see that there's fairly large chunks of these 9-inch strips left over that we could probably fit some of the squares on in order to economize that fabric better. And then we basically need 1/8 of a yard less, which is not insignificant. So another way to kind of cut these same pieces is to basically take those 2 squares that were on that third 4.5-inch wide strip and plop them on the remainder of one of our 9-inch strips. And so that's what you see here. We've got those 2 squares on the end of that first 9-inch strip. We could also put it on the second just as simply. Either way is kind of fine. And so basically what this would look like in terms of instructions would be cut 2 9-inch by width of fabric strips, subcut those 5 9-inch squares, same way we started out last time, 5 9-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles, and 2 4.5-inch squares. And what would happen functionally is they would cut kind of those first 2 sets of pieces, so the squares and rectangles, the large squares and rectangles, and then they would have to take one of those strips and basically cut 4.5 inches, that same 9-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle, and then they'd split that down the middle. Now in this particular instance, they could also just cut the strip width down to 4.5 inches and then fit one of those squares on the end of the first strip and one of the squares on the end of the second strip. It doesn't really matter, but you can have more pieces packed in there, certainly, depending on how many pieces you need to cut, and that would be totally fine. The assumption here is that as people are cutting, and you can actually put this in the before you begin section on your patterns, is that they're going to make the subcut cut first and then split strip widths in half if need be. That keeps things a little bit more ordered, and it's an assumption that you can kind of rely on in your quilting instructions so that you don't need yardage cutting layouts, which just take up a lot of room. They're very messy in quilt patterns. I usually don't recommend adding them. It's better to just kind of simplify your cutting instructions so that you don't need them. Now we could take this a step further and take more of those 4.5-inch squares and put them on the remainder of your 9-inch strip. That would look something like this. The reason we don't want to do this is because it doesn't actually help us minimize fabric. It just adds cutting instruction complexity without actually saving fabric, and that's something we want to avoid. So it's much better to kind of put those 4 squares on the remainder of the 4.5-inch wide width of strips so that we're cutting as many of those 4.5-inch squares from those strips as possible because the strips are already to the correct width. Whenever possible, you don't want to have to cut down the width of your strips because it's an extra cut. First of all, it just takes more work, but it also adds cutting complexity. So definitely maximize the number of pieces you can fit on strips that are already the correct width before you start putting them on strips of other widths. Now, one thing we want to avoid is something that looks like this. So these are not the same pieces. We've kind of changed some pieces, but occasionally you'll have like a long sashing piece or something along those lines that is too wide for any of the strips that you already have, but can still be fit on the remainder. And so a lot of folks will kind of put 1 or 2 of those long skinny sashing rectangles on the remainder, and then they'll kind of fit in smaller squares or rectangles on the other side. The reason we want to avoid this is, again, because we're going to assume that the subcut dimensions are going to get cut first. And so if they did that, they're going to basically cut a 9 by 4.5-inch rectangle first and then try to cut that down into their 4.5-inch squares, which is great. They'll get 2 4.5-inch squares out of that. But now there's not enough remainder of that strip to actually cut that 13.5-inch rectangle, that long, skinny sashing piece, right? And so if they've already kind of cut their 4.5-inch strips apart, it's game over. There's not enough fabric left to cut that piece. And so they're going to have to cobble something together or go find some more fabric, which sucks. That's kind of the one scenario that we never want to end up in with our patterns. And so in general, try to avoid this. You want to make sure that all of kind of these smaller pieces that you're fitting in on remainders can all be fit in the same subcut width so that you don't ever end up in this situation. It would be much better to kind of take that long skinny rectangle and put it on one of the 4.5 inch wide strips and then take 3 of those squares and plop it back over on that remainder if you had to. Now, we've kind of covered a lot, right? There's lots of little nuanced rules and things here. So if this feels a little bit overwhelming, quilt math can get very complicated. I really strongly encourage you to check out Mathless Quilts. That's why I built that software, because I was dealing with these kinds of things and spending a lot of time on it as a tech editor and ghostwriter. And so it just speeds up your process so much. And all of these kinds of rules are already built into it. So you don't have to worry about it. It's always going to kind of optimize and strike that balance between cutting complexity and minimizing your fabric. The next kind of guideline to keep in mind is how much excess that you want to have included in your yardage. So this is the question that I get all the time, right? How much is too much? Can I have exact yardage? Should I include an extra strip in case people make a mistake? Like all of these questions, right? And so my rule of thumb is to always have at minimum 2 inches of excess, right? If it's less than that, I'm going to add another 1/4 or an 1/8 yard so that I can basically include a little bit of buffer, because yardage is not always cut square, right? This also accounts for if people like to pre-wash their fabric and they're going to get a little bit of shrinkage that way, or if it's like a very long piece of yardage and you're going to have multiple kind of squaring up every time you shift that piece of yardage over on your cutting mat, things move around a little bit and you might just square up those edges a little bit. So kind of 2 inches is that sweet spot of like having enough excess fabric to deal with that. Any more than that, it becomes a little bit excessive, because then you're buying extra fabric that you may not actually need. And so if your fabric requirement has, only 1.5 inches of excess or 1/2 inch of excess, you definitely want to include a note. Put an asterisk on your fabric requirements table with a big note at the bottom of the table and be like, look, this is nearly exact or exact yardage. You may want to buy a little bit extra just depending on your preferences, right? Give your reader as much information as they need so that they don't run into trouble based on their preferences, right? Likewise, if you're going to include more than that, so if you've got 10 inches of extra fabric, that's like 1/3 of a yard almost, right? That may be great for some quilters who tend to make a mistake and want to have that extra buffer room and don't mind having small amounts of excess fabric left over and building their scrap stash and all of that. But for some quilters, that's going to frustrate them because they're going to end up building up this kind of like room full of remnants, right? And they don't really want all of this excess fabric. And so 2 inches, I find, is kind of the right balance between making sure they have enough and they don't get into trouble with their fabric requirements, and not making too much so that they end up with too much fabric left over that they don't want. And really what all of this is about is just putting the power into the hands of your readers so that they have the information they need to make the right choice for them and their preferences, right? Quilters can always choose to buy a little bit more fabric, and many of them will, as a way to build their stash, right? But we don't want to force them into that. And so if you're calculating your yardage requirements and you round up to the closest 1/8 or 1/4 yard increment and you have less than 2 inches of excess, that's where you want to add another 1/8 or add another 1/4 if you happen to be doing 1/4 yard increments instead. And so if you do that, you're going to end up with the 2 inches plus the width of an 1/8 of yard, which is basically 4.5 inches. While we're on the topic of kind of what increment to round to, I recommend always going to a 1/4 yard or an 1/8 of yard. My preference is an 1/8 of yard. Yes, most quilt shops probably won't cut in an 1/8 yard increment, but it kind of gives you the most exact measurement without having to add like too much excess in there, like we talked about, right? What I don't like doing is rounding to a 1/3 yard increment. And the reason for that is that most quilt shops will not cut in 1/3 yards. It screws up their inventory and math because a 1/3 is like a repeating decimal, right? Inventory systems don't like it. And so most quilt shops just simply won't make those cuts. They'll almost always do 1/4 yard cuts for you. Sometimes they'll do 1/8 yard cuts, but again, that just helps you keep from having way too much excess. What we're trying to do here is get the customer the most accurate information that we can so that they can make an informed decision based on their preferences and their skill set about how much fabric to buy and be happy with the quantity they've bought without having a ton of excess left over that they don't want. That's the goal here. And so kind of following these guidelines helps ensure this is the best way that I have found to kind of guarantee that fact and end up with happy customers. Alrighty, that's all I've got for today. I hope you found that helpful. Quilt math is like a topic all of its own that we will definitely cover in future videos, but hopefully this kind of covers the basics. I will see you next week for Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya.